I love the quote from John Lewis that Lori used in her opening words, and want to share a story with you this morning about making good trouble here in Portsmouth in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement. During my sophomore year at Portsmouth High, which was way back in 1959, the school received several letters from African students asking to be considered as exchange students at the high school. Our principal passed these letters on to the student council for consideration. Always interested in Africa, I eagerly volunteered to help. British rule was just starting to crumble at that time, and African countries were desperately trying to find ways to educate their youth to be better prepared for independence. Our student council team decided to focus on a young man from Kenya, Juguna Karagoi. He was the oldest of 11 siblings and lived with his family in a village outside of Nairobi. Kenya at that time had only one high school for African youth, and that school could only accommodate 50 students. Juguna was 51st on the list, so we picked him. What followed was a flurry of letters and phone calls with the sponsoring organization in New York, the African American Student Foundation. Eventually, after lots of paperwork and lots of back and forth, we were told that before our offer received final approval, we had to find a family in town willing to host him, at least for his first 6 months here. Somehow, in our eagerness, we hadn't thought ahead to that. So I went home and sheepishly asked Mom and Dad if we could host him at our house. They talked it over, slept on it, and agreed. I don't know why they agreed, but it turned out to be a courageous decision, considering what followed. When we presented our plans to the school board, the trouble began. There were a series of meetings, all covered with banner headlines in the Portsmouth Herald. Don't you love the subtitle of this one? African Student Stirs Rumpus. The opposition was led by one of the school board members and her brother, a municipal judge in town. The meetings, the headlines went on for weeks before the board finally agreed to accept Juguna into Portsmouth High. Offering eloquent support at all these meetings was Reverend Jonathan Papandrew, pictured in the middle photo. After we won approval, he continued to support Juguna and my family, inviting him to his home for meals and conversations, taking him on outings, and much more. Reverend Papandrew was always going to be part of the story I shared with you today. But incredibly, it wasn't until I pulled out my old scrapbook and reread these articles that I realized he was the minister at South Church. And as I did a little more research and read his obituary, I learned that he had a long history of making good trouble, especially in the Civil Rights Movement. He was part of the group of ministers that marched from Selma to Montgomery. He was jailed with Dr. Martin Luther King and others. And back in Portsmouth, joined with the NAACP to help integrate the Wentworth by the Sea and other facilities in Portsmouth. The Portsmouth Herald was our other ally, a good one. And they documented Juguna's arrival at our home in August of 1960. As I look at this picture, my mom seems a bit hesitant. I wonder if she was having second thoughts. By then, the middle of the night phone calls had started. Hate-filled calls, harassing my parents at all hours. And the Portsmouth Herald had received several letters to the editor advocating that my dad be fired from the Navy Yard, contending that Jaguna might be a communist spy. As soon as Mom and Dad had shown him to his room that day, Jaguna immediately took off his good suit and returned to the living room wearing a t-shirt and shorts. My mother almost fainted. His legs were covered from his thighs to his ankles with pale scars that stood out clearly against his dark skin. He explained to us that he and his friends were made to play soccer with boys who attended a British school near his village, but the African boys played barefoot with no gear, while the British boys wore full gear, including metal cleats. It was the first of many culture shocks on our journey together. For instance, Jaguna had never slept in a bed and preferred to sleep sitting up on the floor of his room. He had a difficult time adjusting to our set meal times and separate foods. He had always eaten from a communal village pot whenever he felt hungry. However, the culture shocks went both ways. More than once, we found ourselves truly shocked by the cultural attitudes we encountered here in Portsmouth. Jaguna arrived with only a few clothes, all perfectly suitable for Nairobi, but certainly not to go through a school year in New Hampshire. So one of our first trips after his arrival was to Goodman's men's clothing store on Congress Street, where my dad did all his shopping. They greeted Dad warmly when we walked in, but then politely informed him that Jaguna would not be welcome to try anything on, not even a jacket. And they assured us that the other stores in town all had the same policy. Reverend Papandrew to the rescue. He spearheaded a clothing drive, probably drawing heavily from South Church members, and soon Jaguna had what he needed. This generosity continued throughout Jaguna's stay with us. But the surprises continued as well. Dad couldn't find a barber in town to cut Jaguna's hair, eventually asking a black coworker at the Navy Yard who set him up with a man in town who cut hair out of his home. And we were more than once refused seating at restaurants when Jaguna was with us. I remember looking at a room full of empty tables and having the host tell my dad that there were no tables available for us. My parents both lost friends who thought it was awful to have a black boy living in our house with their white daughter. In short, we got a close-up view of what racism felt like. It was maddening and frustrating and debilitating. And what was stunning was that there was a sizable black population in Portsmouth at this time, with the Navy Yard, Pease Air Base, and the Coast Guard station in full swing. And these members of our community faced this racism every day. We had no idea. That's probably the definition of white privilege, huh? Jaguna was received more hospitably at the high school. His teachers welcomed his perspectives in their classrooms, and there was a group of guys in our class who befriended him, helped him navigate his course schedule in the cafeteria, and took him fishing, hiking, and bowling after school, and much more. My late husband, Michael, was the ringleader of this group. If he were here, he would tell you with a characteristic Irish wink that Jaguna was his way in the door. He started spending more and more time at our house, and before long, we began dating, often taking Jaguna with us. Just a note about the Kyrie and Sanctus I chose for this service. A few weeks after Jaguna arrived, he received a copy of the Missa Luba, the Latin Mass sung by a group in the Congo. He loved this album. He had a record player in his room and played this album. It was 245 RPM records at least 1,000,000 times while he was with us. When I found these clips on YouTube, it brought me right back to that time, and I could see his big smile listening to this music. But I wonder if my mother, working in the kitchen right outside his bedroom door, loved it quite as much after the 1,000,000th playing. But I never heard her complain. Jaguna ended up staying with us for 2 years. Despite the issues we had in the beginning of his stay, it was also a rich and rewarding experience. We learned so much from him about his life in Kenya and got to see our life through his eyes. And not only did my parents welcome Jaguna, but our house became the gathering spot for other African students who were hosted in high schools nearby. Jaguna's room was quite large, so they could easily stay overnight. I remember weekends when 3 or 4 other students would gather, talking, laughing, sharing stories, singing, doing limbo in the dining room with bongo drums playing. And my friends and I were lucky enough to be able to join in to some of this. Then when I graduated, Jaguna moved in with another family in town, the Hislips, for his last year of high school. He dreamed of becoming a doctor. At that time, there was only one native doctor in all of Kenya. But the education gap was just too great and that hill a bit too high. So Mrs. Hislop, a guidance counselor at Portsmouth High, helped him get a scholarship to a nursing program in Boston, a degree that made him, for all purposes, the medical professional for his village area when he went home. And I went on to Catholic University in Washington, where I actively participated in the civil rights movement. There were lots of opportunities. Our choir was asked to join with the choir of Howard University, a black college nearby, for 2 major memorial concerts following the assassination of President Kennedy. In the course of rehearsing and singing together, we built friendships and ties, and so we started demonstrating together, arm in arm, black, white, marching down Constitution Avenue to protest in front of the Capitol building. "We Shall Overcome" became a very familiar anthem. And in my mind, I had indeed overcome my own racism through these experiences. I was all in when it came to racial justice. But as I stepped away to raise my children and focus on my work life, it was just too easy to put on blinders and not pay attention to what was happening. I've read a lot about the Holocaust and often wondered what I would have done if I had lived in Germany then. I fear I know. The horrors of Jim Crow, housing segregation, job discrimination, the growth of the prison industrial complex, and so much more were happening all around me on my watch, and I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't all in. I was checked out. And I even question in retrospect whether I was ever all in. Last summer, I had an opportunity to have lunch with Mary Cruz, one of my friends from high school, who was visiting from Hawaii. Mary and I are standing together on the far right of this picture. In the course of our lunch together, Mary told me how much being on the cheering squad meant to her and how it made her high school years bearable. When I asked what she meant, she shared some very hurtful racial experiences she had had in high school. I was stunned. To me, she was simply a beautiful, talented classmate. We practiced together almost every day after school, spent hours together, and I had no idea. I thought I had become so sensitive to racial slights through our experiences with Jaguna, but yet I was totally blind to what she was experiencing. Mary helped me realize that I've only skimmed the surface of my white privilege. Realize that I still have a lot of work to do. When you're not the one feeling the brunt of discrimination, it's just all too easy to look the other way and to not see what's right in front of you. Life has a funny way of circling us back to our roots. As I look back, I'm enormously grateful to this gentle young man from Kenya for all that he taught me and for the richness he brought to my life. I'm also filled with gratitude and awe for the role my parents played. They not only welcomed him into our home, but also into their hearts at a time when that was a very risky thing to do. Their acceptance of Jaguna into our home was nothing short of courageous at this time of racial unrest in the country. I didn't fully appreciate that at the time. And I'm so grateful to be part of this church, this beloved community. I had many revelations preparing this sermon. And I realize now that this church, through Reverend Papandrew and the generosity of the members here during his tenure, had a positive impact on me and my family long before Michael and I walked through its front doors in 2016. That positive influence started back when I was just 16. And now, amazingly, here I am all these years later, working with a wonderful team of fellow congregants to find a new settled minister for our beloved community, and hoping that we can find one in the proud tradition of Reverend Andrew, who was warm and generous and constant, and who most certainly acted on his faith in the larger community. I want to live my values in the wider community too, at least try. So I've enrolled in a course given by two of the presenters at one of the UU General Assembly workshops I attended in June. The course, A White Ally Toolkit, has nothing to do with working with people of color. Instead, it focuses on working first with ourselves, rooting out and acknowledging our own implicit biases, which I still have, and then learning how to have honest and meaningful conversations about race with our white friends and family members. We're the ones that need to do the work. And I'm reading more and watching films like 13th, which was a real eye-opener for me. I know this late-in-life education and self-examination won't be a smooth or easy journey, but I want to give it a try. I'm ready, once again, to make some good trouble. May it be so.